Picture this. It's June 25th, 2024. You're 22 years old. You make about 30,000 shillings a month, roughly $230, working a gig you found through a WhatsApp group that connects Nairobi freelancers to clients in Texas and Berlin. You pay your rent through your phone. You buy your githeri through your phone. You tip the Matatu conductor through your phone. The mobile money platform you're using, M-Pesa, moves more cash in a single year than the entire formally measured GDP of your country, by a factor of nearly 3. And yet, on this Tuesday afternoon, you're not paying for anything. You are climbing the gates of Parliament. Behind you, thousands of other Gen Z Kenyans are doing the same. Inside, members of Parliament, the second highest paid legislators in the world per capita, a fact you have screenshotted on your phone several times this week, are voting on a finance bill that would slap new taxes on bread, on cooking oil, on sanitary pads, on the very mobile money transfers that hold your life together. The plan is to raise an additional $2.7 billion in revenue to plug a hole in the national budget. A hole that the International Monetary Fund has politely suggested must be plugged. A hole that exists, in part, because a decade ago a previous administration borrowed roughly $5 billion from China to build a shiny new railway. A railway that now hauls trains, frequently half empty, through some of the most beautiful wildlife reserves on Earth and bleeds money on every trip. You and the crowd break through. A section of Parliament catches fire, tear gas, live rounds. By the time the smoke clears, more than 50 protesters are dead. Within 24 hours, the President of Kenya withdraws the entire finance bill on live television. And meanwhile, somewhere in a glass tower in Nairobi's Upper Hill, a 31-year-old fintech founder is closing a funding round that values his 3-year-old startup at over $400 million. This absolutely cinematic tangle of contradictions is Kenya, Africa's largest startup hub, the third largest economy in Sub-Saharan Africa, the country that taught the entire developing world how to do digital banking, and a nation drowning in roughly $80 billion of public debt with no one quite sure how to pay it back without sparking another revolution. So today we're pulling apart the whole machine, the M-Pesa Miracle, the Chinese railway that broke the budget, the IMF's polite chokehold, the tea barons in the highlands, the Silicon Savannah, the Gen Z uprising that rewrote the rules of African politics. We're going to walk through all 10 pieces one at a time, and by the end you'll understand why Kenya is simultaneously one of the most exciting and one of the most fragile economies on the African continent. This is the economy of Kenya, explained. 1. The big picture. Why Kenya punches so far above its weight. Before we talk about the dramatic stuff, the burning parliament, the Chinese railway, the M-Pesa Miracle, we have to get our bearings. So let's set the scene with some boring numbers. I promise the boring numbers are actually wild. Kenya has roughly 54 million people, which makes it bigger than Argentina, bigger than Canada, and only slightly smaller than South Korea. Its 2024 nominal GDP, depending on which institution you trust, sits somewhere between $113 billion, World Bank official figure, and $147 billion, IMF latest estimate. That makes it the third largest economy in Sub-Saharan Africa, behind only Nigeria and South Africa. East Africa essentially runs through Kenya the way the eastern seaboard of the United States runs through New York. Nairobi is the regional headquarters, the financial center, the airport hub, the venue where the United Nations Environment Programme has its global headquarters, because, weirdly, it's the only UN agency headquartered in the developing world. Now here is the part that surprises people. Kenya's GDP per capita is about $2,206. That number is, and there is no polite way to say this, low. It's roughly 1/30th of Britain's, 1/40th of America's. By any pure dollar measure, the average Kenyan is poor. And yet Kenya is also widely described in seriousness as the Israel of East Africa, the Singapore of Africa, and Africa's most consequential medium-sized economy. It is the country that mobile banking gurus from Berlin and Mumbai fly to in order to study how the future of money was already invented in 2007. So how can a country that poor be that influential? The answer is that Kenya is structurally weird in a few specific ways. First, the services sector dominates the economy in a way you would normally only see in a much richer country. Financial services, telecommunications, real estate, transport and tourism collectively make up the bulk of output. Second, agriculture still accounts for around 21 to 33% of GDP depending on how you slice it, and over 40% of employment. So Kenya is simultaneously a digital services economy and a smallholder farming economy occupying the same physical map. Third, the informal economy is gigantic. The World Economics Group estimates that roughly 35% of Kenya's actual economic activity occurs outside the formal sector, which is a polite way of saying that on paper, Kenya is a $113 billion economy, and in real life it's probably closer to $530 billion in purchasing power parity terms. The official numbers undercount the country by a wide margin. Kenya's real GDP grew 5.6% in 2023, 4.6% in 2024, and is projected by the IMF to grow at around 4.5 to 5% in 2026. Inflation has fallen from a peak of 9.6% in 2022 to about 3.8% by mid-2025, well within the central bank of Kenya's target band. The Kenyan shilling actually appreciated by 16% against the dollar in 2024, which, when half the rest of frontier market Africa was watching their currencies implode, is borderline miraculous. The central bank cut its policy rate from 10.75% to 10% in early 2025 because, frankly, it could afford to. By 2023, Kenya had become Africa's largest startup hub, measured by both number of deals and amount of capital invested, beating Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt. But, and this is where the smart edgy commentary kicks in, Kenya is also a place where you can earn a degree, speak fluent English, code in 3 languages, and still find yourself unable to afford rent in the city you grew up in. Official unemployment sits around 5.6%, but if you include underemployment and youth not in education, employment or training, the African Development Bank pegs effective youth unemployment at a much harsher 16%. Meanwhile, the poverty rate rose from 38.6% in 2021 to 39.8% in 2022, which is the kind of trend line that gets governments overthrown. Public debt, which we'll dig into later, sits at roughly 66 to 70% of GDP, comfortably above the 55% threshold the World Bank considers prudent. So here's the mental model to hold on to. Kenya is a country with first world ambitions, second world infrastructure in patches, and third world poverty in the cracks. It is the most innovative, most stable, most regionally important economy in East Africa, and it is fragile enough that a single finance bill can put Parliament on fire. Everything else we're about to discuss is just elaboration on that contradiction. 2. The M-Pesa Miracle: how a telecom company accidentally built the world's best bank. Okay, now we get to the fun part. The thing Kenya does better than anyone else on planet Earth. Here's the scenario. The year is 2007. You are a Kenyan in your 30s living in Kibera, one of the largest urban informal settlements in Africa, on the southwestern edge of Nairobi. Your mother lives in Kisumu, about 220 miles away on the shores of Lake Victoria. Every month you need to send her about 2,000 shillings, roughly $20, for medicine and food. Your options are essentially 3. Option 1, send the money on a matatu, a brightly painted, criminally overpacked minibus, and ask the driver to hand it to your mother at the other end. The driver may or may not steal it. The matatu may or may not arrive. If it does, the cut is sometimes 30%. Option 2, take a bus yourself, which costs you a full day of wages and a non-trivial chance of being robbed at one of the rural transit stops. Option 3, open a bank account. Except in 2007, less than 20% of Kenyans had access to any kind of formal financial service. The nearest physical bank branch from your mother's village is a 4-hour walk. The bank charges 500 Kenyan shillings to open an account. That's most of a week's wages. This is the problem M-Pesa was built to solve. The name, by the way, just means mobile money, M for mobile, Pesa for money in Swahili. The story is that Safaricom, Kenya's dominant telecom, majority owned at the time by the British telecom giant Vodafone, with the Kenyan government holding a hefty minority stake, noticed that Kenyans were already using prepaid airtime as a kind of black market currency. You'd send your cousin 200 shillings of airtime as an indirect way of sending him cash. He'd resell it. Brilliant, but messy. So in 2007, with a research grant from the UK's Department for International Development, Safaricom launched a piece of software that ran on the SIM toolkit of the cheapest dumb phone on the market. Every Safaricom user could now deposit cash with a local agent, often the guy who already sold airtime out of a kiosk, and the agent would send the equivalent in digital e-money to the customer's phone number. From there, you could text message the money to anyone with a Safaricom SIM anywhere in the country in seconds. The recipient could either spend the e-money or walk to their nearest agent and withdraw it as cash. That's it. That's the entire concept. No app, no smartphone, no internet, just SMS. The kind of thing that, if you'd pitched it in Silicon Valley in 2007, you'd have been laughed out of the room. You want to do banking with text messages? What happened next is one of the most stunning adoption curves in the history of consumer technology. By 2010, M-Pesa was the most successful mobile phone-based financial service in the developing world. By 2013, 43% of Kenya's GDP was flowing through M-Pesa. By 2024, 96% of Kenyan households had a mobile money account. M-Pesa held a borderline monopolistic 98.9% market share of the mobile payment industry, and the platform processed transactions valued at over $310 billion across 8 countries, more than 2.5 times Kenya's official nominal GDP. To put that in perspective, the entire formal banking system of Kenya, every bank branch, every ATM, every Visa card, every wire transfer, moves less money in a year than M-Pesa. A telecom company, almost by accident, built the most important financial institution in the country. M-Pesa is not free. Safaricom charges, and the charges are not small. Withdrawing 300 shillings, about $2, costs roughly 29 shillings, which is around a 10% fee. For poor users sending small amounts, the cumulative cost is substantial. Critics, including the World Bank, have noted that M-Pesa's near-monopoly status has allowed it to maintain pricing that, in a more competitive market, would not survive. Safaricom is also so dominant in Kenyan telecom and finance that the company by itself accounts for roughly 5% of the entire country's GDP. When Safaricom's CEO sneezes, the Nairobi Securities Exchange catches a cold. In 2024, Safaricom paid out the largest dividend in Kenyan corporate history, over 30 billion Kenyan shillings. A lot of that dividend leaves the country because Vodafone Group still holds a controlling stake. But, and the data is unambiguous on this, M-Pesa has been a net force for human welfare on a scale almost no other private financial product in history can match. An MIT study by Suri and Jack estimated that the rollout of M-Pesa lifted roughly 194,000 Kenyan households, about 2% of all Kenyan households, out of extreme poverty between 2008 and 2014, primarily by enabling women to move out of subsistence agriculture and into small business. Mobile money let small traders save securely for the first time in their lives. It let urban migrants reliably send money home. It cut the rate at which counterfeit cash circulated. It allowed the Kenyan government during the COVID-19 pandemic to disperse welfare payments directly to phones in days rather than months. And here's the punchline. The reason M-Pesa worked in Kenya, and not in, say, the United States, is that Kenya didn't have a functional banking sector for it to compete against. There was no entrenched Bank of America with a lobbying army to crush it. The regulator, the Central Bank of Kenya, looked at this thing in 2007, made the unusually wise call that it was a payment system rather than a bank, and let it grow. Mark Zuckerberg flew to Nairobi in 2016 specifically to study it, calling Kenya a world leader in mobile money. Facebook, WhatsApp, and Apple have all spent the better part of a decade trying to build features that M-Pesa shipped before the iPhone existed. Which leads to a fairly uncomfortable question. If Kenya has the world's best digital banking system and a young English-speaking workforce and Africa's largest startup hub and tea and tourism and a stable shilling, how on earth does it find itself in 2024 with Parliament on fire? To answer that, we have to talk about a railway. 3. The Standard Gauge Railway. A $5 billion cautionary tale with a dining car. Let me tell you about a train. It's a beautiful train. Genuinely. If you have ever ridden the Madaraka Express from Mombasa to Nairobi, you know what I'm talking about. The carriages are clean, the seats recline, there's a dining car. The journey takes about 4.5 hours and rolls right past Tsavo National Park, where if you press your face to the glass at the right moment, you can see elephants and giraffes from your air-conditioned window. A ticket in economy costs about $10. For comparison, the bus takes 8 to 10 hours, gets stuck in traffic, and is run by a guy who appears to believe that lane markings are a polite Western suggestion. This is the standard gauge railway, known to everyone in Kenya simply as the SGR. It is, depending on whom you ask, either the greatest infrastructure achievement in Kenya's post-independence history or the single largest financial mistake the country has ever made. Possibly both. Probably both. Here's the story. In 2014, under President Uhuru Kenyatta, son of Kenya's founding father, scion of one of the country's wealthiest political dynasties, Kenya signed a deal with the Export-Import Bank of China for a roughly $3.2 billion loan to build a brand new, modern, standard gauge railway connecting the Indian Ocean port city of Mombasa to the capital Nairobi. A second tranche the next year added another $1.5 billion to extend the line about 75 miles further inland to Naivasha. Total bill, by 2017, roughly $4.7 billion, which made the SGR the single most expensive infrastructure project in Kenyan history. The grand vision was that the line would eventually push north and west to the Ugandan border at Malaba, and then into Uganda, Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and possibly Burundi. East Africa would be stitched together by a Chinese-built spine of steel. The old British colonial-era railway, built between 1896 and 1901 with indentured Indian labour, and so notoriously deadly to construction workers that the British press of the day called it the Lunatic Express, was a single-track meter-gauge line that, by the 2000s, was operating at maybe 20% of its original capacity. It was slow, it was dangerous, and it was a comically poor fit for a 21st century economy. Goods moved between the port of Mombasa and Nairobi almost entirely by truck, which clogged the Mombasa road with 18-wheelers and turned the journey into a 12-hour endurance event. A modern railway should, in theory, decongest the port, lower freight costs, reduce road accidents, and unlock regional trade. A 2012 government feasibility study claimed the SGR would reduce Kenya's logistics costs by 40% and add 1.5 percentage points to annual GDP growth. Here's reality. By the time the line opened in 2017, the cost per shipping container by rail was roughly $1,270 versus about $650 by truck, twice as much. The promised reduction in freight costs went the wrong direction. The Kenyatta administration tried to fix this by issuing a directive forcing importers to use the SGR for cargo from Mombasa, which a study by University of Nairobi researchers later concluded had driven up shipping costs by nearly 30%. By 2020, a Kenyan court ruled that the entire procurement process, in which the contract had been handed directly to the China Road and Bridge Corporation without an open public tender, because the loan from China Exim Bank required a Chinese contractor, had been illegal under Kenyan procurement law. The numbers continued to look bad. In its first 3 years of operation, the SGR lost approximately $200 million. It has, in nearly every year since, run at a financial loss. The line was supposed to extend to the Ugandan border, but in 2018 Exim Bank declined to fund the next phase, so the SGR currently ends in the small town of Naivasha, about 300 kilometres short of where it was supposed to go. Uganda, the customer the railway was meant to serve, got tired of waiting and hired a Turkish company to build its end of the line on a completely different track gauge. So even when both sides finish, the trains physically will not be able to roll across the border without changing gauge, which is, and I cannot stress this enough, the single dumbest possible outcome for an integrated regional rail network. Meanwhile, the bill comes due. In July 2023, Kenya's semi-annual SGR debt payment to China hit $356 million, which represented nearly 80% of the country's entire debt service for that month. By November 2024, the Kenyan Treasury quietly admitted in its annual public debt management report that it had failed to make payments worth 167.5 billion shillings to China Exim Bank in fiscal year 2023/2024 for the SGR project, triggering an additional 1.68 billion shillings in penalty interest payments. Translation: Kenya has effectively been in periodic technical default on its Chinese SGR loans, papered over with what analysts politely call an extend and pretend approach, in which Beijing reschedules rather than declares default. Now, I have to address the elephant in the room, which is the Chinese debt trap narrative, You've all seen the headlines. China is going to seize the port of Mombasa. Kenya will lose its largest harbour. Belt and Road colonialism. You've heard this story. Here's the truth, because it matters. Researchers at the Johns Hopkins SAIS China-Africa Research Initiative, led by economist Deborah Breutigam, went and read the actual loan contracts when they were finally released in late 2022. The contracts, or three of them, named the Republic of Kenya, represented by the National Treasury as the borrower, fully liable for repayment from general government revenues. The port of Mombasa is not pledged as collateral. The persistent rumour that it was originated, embarrassingly, in a labelling mistake in a Kenyan Auditor General's report. So no, China is not going to seize the port. The loans are sovereign debt. They get paid back the same way Eurobonds get paid back, out of taxes, which is the real problem, because to pay back $5 billion in Chinese SGR debt, plus another roughly $2 billion in Eurobond debt that came due in mid-2024, plus IMF principal and interest, plus World Bank obligations, the Kenyan government needs to either grow the tax base aggressively or cut spending aggressively. And as you may recall from our cold open, when the government tried to grow the tax base aggressively by passing the Finance Bill 2024, 22-year-olds set Parliament on fire. This is the trap the SGR has set. Not a debt trap in the cinematic sense of a Chinese gunboat steaming into Mombasa harbour. A trap in the much more boring, much more real sense of a country that took on too much expensive debt for an asset that doesn't generate enough revenue to service it, and is now trying to pull the difference out of the pockets of citizens who, increasingly, are not going to give it. If you're enjoying this so far, the good, the bad, and the what were they thinking, do me a favour and hit subscribe. We do this for every major economy, and Kenya is one of the most fascinating ones we've covered. We've got more coming. But for now, let's go back further in time, because to understand the debt, you have to understand the T.
So that's a $5 billion railway that doesn't quite reach where it was supposed to go, hauling cargo that mostly travels by truck anyway. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Kenya was already stuck in this trap a century before the Chinese showed up. Different lender, same playbook. Let me show you.
4. Tea, coffee, and cut flowers. The colonial hangover that still feeds the nation. Let's go back to the highlands, the very ground Kenya is built on, in the most literal sense. If you fly from Nairobi out toward the Aberdares or Mount Kenya, somewhere around the moment the air gets cool enough to need a sweater, you start seeing them. Endless, undulating waves of waist-high green bushes carpeting the hillsides like a freshly trimmed billiard table that never ends. Tea fields. Pluck a leaf, crush it between your fingers, and the smell is unmistakable. That astringent, slightly grassy bite that ends up, eventually, in a chipped mug somewhere in Karachi or Cairo or Croydon. Tea is, depending on the year, either Kenya's first or second largest source of foreign exchange earnings. It is the country's leading single export commodity, accounting for roughly 16.3% of total exports in 2024 and contributing about 1.2% of GDP. Kenya is the world's largest exporter of black tea, ranking third overall in tea exports globally behind China and India. There are about 66 tea factories in the country managed by the Kenya Tea Development Agency, serving more than 500,000 smallholder farmers cultivating over 100,000 hectares of tea bushes. Add in the indirect supply chain, pluckers, packers, drivers, auctioneers, and the tea industry supports the livelihoods of an estimated 7 million Kenyans, which is roughly 1 in 8 people in the country. Here's where it gets interesting historically. Kenya doesn't actually have any indigenous tea culture. Tea was introduced to Kenya by a British settler named G.W.L. Kane in 1903, planted near present-day Limuru. Commercial production was scaled up starting in 1924 by Brook Bond, the British tea conglomerate. Coffee, the other great Kenyan export, was introduced even earlier in 1893 by French missionaries. Both were colonial economy crops designed to ship raw agricultural product from the African highlands to processing facilities in Europe. The fancy boutique coffee you bought this morning at the hipster espresso bar in Brooklyn, the one with the little tasting notes saying blackcurrant, bergamot, sun-dried tomato, there is a meaningful chance the beans came from a smallholder farm in Nyeri County, were sold at the Nairobi Coffee Exchange auction, shipped to Antwerp for blending, and sold to your barista's roaster for roughly 35 times what the farmer received per kilogram. That gap is the colonial economy in microcosm. The structure of these export industries, in other words, is still essentially what the British set up a century ago. A patchwork of small farmers grow the raw product. A handful of large processors and auctioneers, many of them subsidiaries of multinationals like Unilever and James Finley, take it to the Mombasa tea auction, the largest tea auction in the world by volume. Pakistan buys about 40% of Kenya's tea exports. Egypt and the United Kingdom are the next largest customers. Then it gets blended, packaged, branded and sold at 3 to 10 times the price Kenya received. The optimist's case is that tea, coffee and horticulture together are still a genuine engine of foreign exchange for Kenya. They are non-oil, climate-permitting commodities in a country whose neighbours mostly do not have anything resembling stable export earners. Kenya's coffee, tea, mate and spices exports were worth about $1.63 billion in 2023, according to UN Comtrade data. Cut flowers are quietly enormous. Kenya is one of the world's top 3 exporters of cut roses, and on any given Valentine's Day, there's a meaningful chance the bouquet your boyfriend bought you at a Tesco in Manchester was grown the previous Tuesday next to Lake Naivasha and flown out of Jomo Kenyatta International Airport to Amsterdam's flower market in less than 36 hours. Now the smart edgy commentary. The structural problem with this entire export complex is that Kenya is, in 2026, still doing essentially what colonial Kenya was doing in 1926. Selling raw, unprocessed, low-margin agricultural commodities into a global market whose pricing it has zero ability to influence. The average price of tea at the Mombasa auction has been declining for 3 consecutive years. In 2022, it routinely traded above $2.40 per kilogram. By 2025, hot weather and subdued rainfall in the tea-growing belt are pushing total marketed production down roughly 5%, and prices have softened. Less than 6% of Kenyan tea is consumed domestically. The Tea Board of Kenya has for years been trying to push that figure to 15%, with limited success. The vast majority of the value add, the branding, the blending, the marketing, the actual conversion of green leaf into Twining's English breakfast, happens in someone else's country. The economic term for this is stuck at the bottom of the value chain. The historical term for this is, well, you know what it is. Tourism follows the same pattern, by the way. Kenya is one of Africa's premier safari destinations, with more than 2 million international visitors in 2023, generating around $2.06 billion in revenue and over 3.6 million visits to national parks and game reserves in the same year. The Masai Mara, Tsavo, Amboseli, the beaches of Diani, these are some of the most coveted travel experiences on Earth. But again, a meaningful share of the profit margin gets captured by foreign tour operators, foreign-owned safari lodges, and international airlines. The Kenyan economy gets the wages of the rangers, the cooks, and the drivers. The investors abroad get the dividends. Here's the data point that should make you pause. As of 2024, diaspora remittances, Kenyans living and working in the United States, the UK, the Gulf, and elsewhere sending money back home, reached an all-time record of $4.95 billion. By 2025, they crossed $5 billion for the first time in history. Remittances are now Kenya's largest single source of foreign exchange. Larger than tea, larger than coffee, larger than tourism. The biggest export of modern Kenya is Kenyans, educated, hard-working, English-speaking, ambitious Kenyans who emigrate, build careers in Houston and Manchester and Dubai, and wire money home. That fact tells you almost everything you need to know about the structural state of the Kenyan domestic labour market, which is a perfect segue, because we have to talk about the labour market next. Specifically, we have to talk about the most political, most explosive, most online generation of African young people in modern history, GenZKenya. 5. GenZKenya, the most dangerous demographic in African politics. Here's a number that should make every politician on the African continent lose sleep at night. Over 75% of Kenyans are under the age of 35. The median age in Kenya is roughly 20 years old. The country's working age population is about 30 million people, and every year, approximately 1 million more Kenyans turn 18 and enter the labour force. They are looking for jobs that in many cases are not there. Or, more precisely, they are looking for jobs that pay enough to actually live in a Nairobi, where the rent on a single-room apartment in a half-decent neighbourhood will eat 60% of an entry-level salary. Now imagine you are one of these young Kenyans. You graduated from the University of Nairobi or Kenyatta University with a degree in computer science or law or business administration. Your parents, who themselves probably grew up on a smallholder farm in Kisumu or Eldoret, sold a parcel of family land to put you through school, with the promise that an education was the way out. You speak fluent English, you speak Swahili, probably one or two of the more than 60 ethnic languages spoken in Kenya. You can do the kind of remote work that, in 2026, an American company will pay $40 to $80 an hour for. According to Jobleed's data, Kenya's online freelance economy has grown 216% over the past 5 years, and Kenya is now arguably the most lucrative African market for remote-first global gig work. But you also live in a country where, simultaneously, the President's office spent roughly $1.5 million on a single chartered jet flight to the United States in May 2024, where Kenyan members of parliament are reportedly the second highest-paid legislators in the world per capita, where the official residences of the First Lady and the Deputy First Lady have separate budget lines worth more than $3.8 million each, and where corrupt politicians regularly flaunt $128,000 designer watches on Instagram. Former President Uhuru Kenyatta himself once admitted, on the record, that the Kenyan government was losing roughly $18 million per day to corruption. Per day. Now hand this 22-year-old a smartphone. Connect them to TikTok and X and WhatsApp groups with 10,000 of their friends. Tell them their taxes are about to go up to plug a budget hole created by a railway they didn't authorise and a Eurobond they didn't sign, and see what happens. What happened on June 25, 2024 was the largest, most spontaneous, most leaderless, most online popular uprising in modern Kenyan history. The trigger was the Finance Bill 2024. The Ruto administration, working with the IMF as part of a 38-month, $2.34 billion loan program signed in April 2021, was trying to raise an additional $2.7 billion in tax revenue to narrow the fiscal deficit. The bill proposed new taxes on bread, cooking oil, sanitary pads, motor vehicles, and even mobile money transfers. Many of these levies were direct conditions of the IMF program. Kenyan Gen Z, organising on X and TikTok with no central leader and no formal political party, read the bill, line by line, and tore it apart in real time. There were spreadsheets, there were threads, there were videos breaking down what each clause would actually cost an average household. One viral post calculated that a Kenyan earning 50,000 shillings per month would lose roughly 12,000 shillings, nearly a quarter of their take-home pay, to the new taxes. On June 18th, the protests started peacefully. By June 25th, when MPS voted to pass the bill anyway, demonstrators stormed and partially set fire to the Parliament building in Nairobi. Kenyan police responded with live ammunition. The official death toll, as documented by Kenyan human rights organisations and reported by Al Jazeera and Reuters, climbed from 39 in the first weeks to at least 65 protesters killed by late 2025, with hundreds more injured and dozens forcibly disappeared in extrajudicial abductions that continued well into 2025. Kenya recorded more than 1,800 demonstrations in 2024, the most volatile year in the country's recent history. President Ruto withdrew the finance bill on national television on June 26, 2024. He fired most of his cabinet. He pledged austerity. The IMF kept negotiating. The protests didn't stop. Anniversary protests in June 2025 again turned deadly. As of late 2025, IMF staff were still in Nairobi negotiating a new program to replace the one that had effectively collapsed under public pressure. As of early 2026, Kenya remains in what the IMF officially classifies as high risk of debt distress, with the final review of the previous program suspended in March 2025, leaving roughly $850 million in undisbursed loans that Kenya cannot access without satisfying conditions that protesters have made functionally impossible to satisfy. The Kenyan state genuinely is broke. The deficit genuinely does need to close. Foreign creditors genuinely will eventually stop lending if Nairobi cannot demonstrate fiscal discipline. From a pure macroeconomics perspective, the Finance Bill 2024 was technically doing the kind of thing the textbooks say a country in Kenya's position is supposed to do: raise revenue, narrow the deficit, restore market confidence, secure the next IMF disbursement, avoid sovereign default. The mechanics were correct. But the mechanics were colliding with the politics in a way the IMF, with its decades of experience, should have seen coming. As Carlos Lopez, a development economist and former executive secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, put it, in Kenya, the government crossed the limit of what's acceptable. You cannot tax bread in a country where 40% of the population is under the poverty line, where the president just chartered a $1.5 million private jet, and where the median citizen is a 20-year-old with a smartphone and a verified Twitter account. The basic distributional unfairness is too vivid. The data is too easy to share. The screenshot is too easy to forward. This is the new physics of African political economy. GenZKenya did not need a labour union, a political party, a charismatic leader, or even an organising committee. They had a hashtag #RejectFinanceBill 2024, and a smartphone. And they pulled off something that traditional African opposition parties, including those led by perennial candidate Raila Odinga, had not managed in decades. They forced an incumbent president to publicly reverse his entire fiscal program and watch his approval rating crater into the teens. The implication of this for every other African government with a youth bulge, an IMF program, and a debt problem is, to use a technical term, terrifying. And it brings us neatly to the next chapter, which is about the institution that helped engineer all of this. The polite, well-spoken, white-collar elephant in every Kenyan policy room, the IMF. 6. The IMF, Kenya's least favourite friend with benefits. Let me start with a basic fact that, depending on how you feel about international financial institutions, will either make you nod sagely or grind your teeth. Kenya joined the IMF on February 3, 1964, 3 months after independence from Britain. It has, in the 62 years since, signed 22 separate IMF arrangements. That's an average of one new IMF program every 2.8 years for the entirety of the country's post-colonial existence. The current program, a $2.34 billion extended fund facility/extended credit facility arrangement, was signed in April 2021. As of March 2026, Kenya owes the IMF approximately $2.8 billion in special drawing rights in outstanding loans, which works out to roughly $3.7 billion at current exchange rates. If your country has been in an IMF program for most of its independent existence, that is not structurally a relationship of equals. It is something else. The exact word for it is the subject of a fairly contentious academic debate. Pan-Africanists, most famously the late Burkinabe revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara, who in a 1987 speech to the Organisation of African Unity declared, "Debt is a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa, aimed at subjugating its growth and development through foreign rules," would call it neocolonialism. The IMF would call it a partnership. So let's actually look at the mechanics. Because this is where it gets interesting and uncomfortable. The basic IMF deal works like this. A country gets into balance of payments trouble. It cannot pay back its foreign creditors. It needs hard currency. The IMF says, fine, here is a multi-year package of low-interest loans denominated in SDRs, dispersed in tranches. In exchange, the country agrees to a set of policy conditions, what the institution calls conditionalities. Typically, these include cutting the fiscal deficit, raising tax revenue, removing subsidies, sometimes privatizing state-owned enterprises, and tightening monetary policy. The official theoretical justification is that these reforms restore macroeconomic stability and creditor confidence, so private capital flows back in, the economy grows, and everyone wins. The textbooks call this structural adjustment. In Kenya, this story has been running for 40 years. The first big wave of structural adjustment programs came in the 1980s and early 1990s, under Presidents Moi and Kibaki. The IMF and World Bank required Kenya to devalue its currency, cut government employment, slash subsidies on staples, privatize state enterprises, and remove price controls. The results charitably were mixed. GDP growth fell from an annual average of 7.2% in the 1970s to 4.2% in the 1980s and 2.2% in the 1990s. Poverty rose substantially. This entire decade is now widely referred to in development economics literature, including in the IMF's own retrospective papers, as Africa's lost development decade. Fast forward to 2021, Kenya, hammered by COVID, sliding oil prices for its tourism customers, supply chain shocks from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the legacy debt from Uhuru Kenyatta's infrastructure binge, signed yet another IMF program. The conditions were familiar. Cut the fiscal deficit, raise tax revenue, suspend fuel and fertilizer subsidies, restore primary surplus, demonstrate sizable and upfront fiscal consolidation. Ruto, who took office in September 2022, suspended the fuel and fertilizer subsidies almost immediately. Protests broke out. Subsidies were partially reinstated. The 2023 finance bill, also IMF-backed, introduced a 2.5% housing levy and doubled VAT on fuel from 8% to 16%. More protests. Then came Finance Bill 2024, with its $2.7 billion in proposed new taxes, which the IMF publicly praised as being in line with the required sizable and upfront fiscal consolidation, about a week before Parliament caught fire. Now here is where the smart, edgy commentary gets sharp. The case for the defence runs as follows. Kenya borrowed too much money under Uhuru Kenyatta. The lenders were Chinese state banks, commercial bondholders in London, and the World Bank. The IMF had nothing to do with the original borrowing decisions. By the time the IMF showed up in 2021, Kenya was already at high risk of debt distress, and the IMF was, in effect, the country's least bad option. Without IMF support, Kenya would have had to either default on its Eurobonds in mid-2024, which would have been catastrophic for the shilling and for poverty rates, or impose far harsher austerity unilaterally. The IMF, through its extended fund facility, gave Kenya time. It also provided the dollar liquidity that allowed Kenya to roll over its $2 billion June 2024 Eurobond without a default. In October 2024, the IMF approved $606 million in disbursements even after the finance bill protests. Without this, the Kenyan shilling would likely have collapsed, the price of imported food would have spiked, and the people most hurt would have been the very protesters in the streets. That is the argument. It is, on its narrow technical terms, defensible, but here is the counter-argument, and it has data behind it. When the IMF designs a fiscal consolidation package for a country like Kenya, it tends to rely heavily on expenditure cuts and consumption taxes, VAT, fuel levies, housing levies, mobile money taxes, because these are the easiest revenue sources to raise quickly. The IMF's own 2023 paper, titled How to Avoid a Debt Crisis in Sub-Saharan Africa, explicitly acknowledged that Sub-Saharan African countries tend to rely excessively on expenditure cuts to reduce fiscal deficits, and then, in the same document, continue to recommend further fiscal adjustment. The mechanism is regressive almost by design. A flat VAT on bread costs a single mother in Kibera a much larger share of her income than it costs a private equity partner in Karen. ActionAid Kenya and other civil society organisations have, for years, urged the IMF to revise its debt sustainability analysis to incorporate a government's ability to fund basic public goods, health, education, social protection, before prioritising debt repayment. The IMF has broadly declined to do so. There's also a deeper problem, which is that the IMF is structurally incapable of addressing the distributional question of who actually benefits from the borrowing it helps refinance. In Kenya's case, much of the original debt, the Chinese SGR loans, the commercial Eurobonds, large infrastructure tenders, was incurred under conditions that anti-corruption czar John Githongo and others have alleged involved substantial corruption and kickbacks. When the bill comes due, the IMF asks ordinary Kenyans to pay it back through higher VAT and fuel levies. The original beneficiaries of the lending, the contractors, the politicians, the offshore bank accounts, are not asked to contribute. As one widely shared protest placard during the 2024 demonstrations put it, IMF, World Bank, stop the modern-day slavery. Another simply read, colonialism never ended. Here's the honest synthesis. The IMF in Kenya is neither the cartoonish villain that Pan-African Twitter sometimes paints it as, nor the pure-hearted technocratic lifeguard that the institution paints itself as. It is, more accurately, a bank manager. As economist Charlie Robertson told the Africa Report in 2024, at the end of the day, they want to know that they will be paid back, and that they will be the first to be paid back when debts are called in. The IMF's job is to make sure the foreign creditors get repaid. The IMF's job is not to ensure that the burden of repayment falls fairly on Kenyan society, or that the original borrowers face accountability for how they use the money. Those are political questions, and the IMF formally does not do politics. The trouble for Ruto is that everyone in Kenya now knows this. The protesters do, the opposition does, the Kenyan press does, even quietly, parts of the Kenyan civil service do. which is why in 2026 the IMF is in the genuinely awkward position of negotiating a new program with a Kenyan government whose voters have demonstrated, at the cost of dozens of lives, that they will physically prevent the IMF's preferred austerity measures from being implemented. This is a problem. It is also a fascinating natural experiment in the limits of conditionality. We will all be watching to see how it ends. If you're enjoying this breakdown so far, do me a favour, hit that like button. And let me know in the comments, should the IMF restructure Kenya's debt and let the country off the hook? Or does that just teach future borrowers that they can default with no consequences? It is genuinely one of the hardest questions in modern development economics, and I'd love to hear how you'd answer it. In the meantime, let's leave the macroeconomics for a moment and walk into a glass tower in Nairobi's upper hill, because the same country that just lit Parliament on fire is also, simultaneously, the most exciting startup ecosystem on the African continent.
Heavy stuff, I know, but here's what's wild. The same week Parliament was burning, 3 Nairobi startups closed funding rounds worth 9 figures combined. If this breakdown is helping things click, hit subscribe. We do this for every major economy, and the next one's already in the works. Now let me show you the other Kenya.
7. The Silicon Savannah, Africa's startup capital. Now let me take you to a different Nairobi. You're standing on Ngong Road in the neighbourhood of Kilimani, on the western edge of the city. The traffic is, as a baseline state of being, terrible. Boda motorcycle taxis weave between SUVs at angles that violate the laws of geometry. But step into the lobby of any of the dozen newish glass and steel office buildings around you and the vibe changes. There is a barista pulling shots that would not embarrass Brooklyn. There are 27-year-olds in Allbirds and AirPods reviewing pitch decks on MacBooks. There is the unmistakable hum of money about to be wired through a Series B closing. And on the wall of one particular co-working space there is a sign that reads, with no apparent irony, "Welcome to the Silicon Savannah." This is the part of Kenya that Mark Zuckerberg flew in to see. This is the part that drew Microsoft to announce a $1 billion expansion in Kenya. This is the part where, in 2023, Kenyan startups raised approximately $1.1 billion in venture capital funding, more than any other African country, beating out the much larger economies of Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt. According to the Big Deal Africa, Kenya alone captured roughly 28 to 29% of all African startup funding in 2023 and 2024. This is, depending on how you measure, the single largest startup ecosystem in Africa by both deals and dollars deployed. Let me give you a sense of what these companies actually do, because the variety is genuinely astonishing. Twiga Foods uses an Uber-style logistics platform to connect smallholder Kenyan farmers directly with urban Mama Mboga, the small open-air vegetable vendors that supply roughly 70% of urban food retail. By cutting out 3 or 4 layers of middlemen, Twiga has, on average, both lifted farmer prices and lowered consumer prices for the same tomato. Apollo Agriculture uses satellite data, machine learning crop models, and mobile phone credit scoring to extend short-term agricultural input loans to farmers who have never had a bank account. Sendwave, founded in 2014 by an American MIT graduate and now a subsidiary of WorldRemit, built an app that became one of the cheapest channels for Kenyans in the United States to send remittances home, undercutting Western Union by a wide margin. Cellulant processes payments across roughly 35 African countries from a Nairobi-based platform. M-Pesa sells solar home systems on a pay-as-you-go basis, financed against future M-Pesa payments, and has put solar power into more than 4 million African homes. Marasi, Kuda, Sky.Garden, iProcure, SoccerWatch. The list of credible, scaling, venture-backed Kenyan startups is frankly longer than I have time for in a single video. The supporting ecosystem is real and dense. iHub, a co-working and mentorship space founded in Nairobi in 2010, has helped launch more than 152 startups. The Kenyan government's flagship infrastructure project for tech, Konza Technopolis, a planned digital city about 60 kilometers south of Nairobi, has been under development since 2008, and while it has been the subject of substantial delays and skepticism, it is, fitfully, taking shape and is targeted to create roughly 200,000 jobs by 2030. The Kenyan government's Digital Master Plan, launched in 2022, prioritizes broadband infrastructure, digital ID, and online government services. Mobile penetration in Kenya stood at roughly 119% of the population in 2024, meaning, on average, Kenyans now own more than one active SIM card per person. 66 million mobile connections. 5G is rolling out across Nairobi and Mombasa. So why is this happening here, in a country whose GDP per capita is barely $2,200, rather than somewhere richer? Several reasons converge, and they are worth understanding. First, the English-speaking common law legal system Kenya inherited from the British is a massive structural advantage for foreign venture capital. A San Francisco partner at Andreessen Horowitz can read a Kenyan term sheet without a translator. The contracts work. Disputes can, in theory, be litigated through a recognizable legal framework. Second, M-Pesa, which we covered earlier, provides a payments rail that any new startup can plug into immediately. You don't need to build a payment system from scratch the way an early-stage Indian startup did. The plumbing already exists. Third, the demographic engine. A massive, young, increasingly educated population. The same demographic that lit Parliament on fire is also, in a different building on a different day, writing the iOS code for an agricultural microfinance app. Fourth, and most importantly, Kenya has functioning capital markets. The Nairobi Securities Exchange is one of the more liquid stock exchanges on the continent. Banking is competitive. Equity Bank Kenya, founded as a tiny building society in 1984, is now one of the largest banks in East Africa. Local pension funds, sovereign wealth-style state actors, and a substantial Asian Kenyan business community all provide domestic capital that complements foreign venture money. The Silicon Savannah has its own real problems. Tech employment as a share of total Kenyan employment is small. The sector contributes roughly 1.1% of GDP, which is meaningful but not transformative. Most of the founders are men, most are based in Nairobi, and most are from a small subset of universities. A wave of high-profile failures, including the dramatic implosion of the Bay Area-funded Kenyan logistics startup Kobo 360, and a significant down round at Twiga Foods in 2023, have raised real questions about whether the unit economics of tech-enabled logistics for emerging markets actually work at scale, or whether much of what was funded was essentially burning Bay Area money to subsidize the cost of doing business in places without functioning infrastructure. Total venture funding into African startups dropped sharply from 2022 to 2024, and Kenya was not immune. Total deal volume in 2024 was lower than in 2023, even though Kenya retained its lead share. There is a growing concern voiced by Kenyan economists like David N.D., who is also Ruto's senior economic advisor in one of those plot twists that only happens in Kenya, that the Silicon Savannah is creating a bifurcated economy, a thin, rich, English-speaking, dollar-denominated layer of tech professionals enjoying salaries comparable to Berlin or Toronto, sitting on top of a much broader Kenyan workforce that earns shillings, pays VAT on bread, and watches the gap widen. There's also a deeper philosophical point. The Kenyan startup ecosystem is, to a significant degree, funded by foreign capital and built to solve problems that foreign-funded companies can monetize. Twiga is partly funded by Goldman Sachs. Sendwave is owned by World Remit. M-Copa's largest shareholders are international development finance institutions. Profits flow outward as much as inward. This is not necessarily bad. Capital flows are how poor countries become rich countries. But it does complicate the narrative that the Silicon Savannah is purely an indigenous Kenyan triumph. It is, more accurately, an indigenous Kenyan talent pool being skillfully deployed by a mix of local and global capital. But, and this is the honest takeaway, the Silicon Savannah is real. It is the most credible knowledge economy ecosystem in Sub-Saharan Africa. It is plausibly the single best long-term bet for how Kenya escapes the colonial commodity trap we discussed earlier. If Kenya can leverage its $180 billion projected digital economy opportunity, a figure that the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis has been quoting since 2020, into actual broad-based prosperity, this will be how it does it. The tea fields will not save Kenya. The Chinese railway certainly will not save Kenya. The hope, if there is one, lives in those glass towers in Upper Hill. But to make all of that work, Kenya needs to fix one more thing. The thing that is the actual root cause of the finance bill, the IMF program, the Gen Z protests, and the declining shilling. The thing that everyone in Kenyan politics talks about constantly and almost no one wants to fix. We need to talk about the debt. 8. The debt mountain. How $80 billion ate the budget. Let's get specific. As of late 2025, Kenya's total public debt sits at approximately 11 trillion Kenyan shillings, which works out to roughly $80 billion at current exchange rates. As a share of GDP, that is about 66 to 70% by official measures, depending on the quarter. The World Bank and the IMF both consider any debt to GDP ratio above 55% to be the threshold at which a developing economy enters meaningfully elevated risk territory. Kenya has been above that threshold for several years, and the IMF has, since March 2025, formally classified Kenya at high risk of debt distress. How did we get here? It's worth walking through the numbers because the story is depressingly very simple. Kenya's public debt to GDP ratio was about 41% in 2014. By 2024, it had nearly doubled to a peak of roughly 78%, before declining slightly with the appreciation of the shilling and some fiscal consolidation. In one decade, the country added approximately $50 billion to its public debt stock. That is, in per capita terms, every Kenyan man, woman and child now owes about $1,500 in foreign debt, which, when the median income is around $2,200 a year, is not a small number. Now, where did that debt come from? Roughly half of it is external debt, money owed to foreign creditors, and the other half is domestic debt, owed to local Kenyan banks and pension funds in shillings. The external part is the part that matters most for the headline crises, because it has to be repaid in hard currency. The composition of Kenya's external debt is, broadly, China is the largest single bilateral creditor. From 2000 to 2023, Kenya borrowed approximately $9.6 billion from Chinese state lenders, primarily Exim Bank, making Kenya the fourth largest African borrower from China, behind only Angola, Ethiopia and Egypt. The bulk of this is the standard gauge railway, plus a network of expressways, port upgrades and a couple of dams. Eurobonds, commercial bonds issued in international capital markets, are another massive chunk. Kenya has issued 5 Eurobonds since 2014, totaling around $7 billion, with the $2 billion June 2024 Eurobond that was successfully refinanced, with IMF help, being the most politically charged one. The World Bank and the African Development Bank hold large multilateral positions, generally on much more concessional terms. The IMF itself is a creditor, with about $3.7 billion outstanding, and, in a relatively recent twist, the United Arab Emirates has emerged as a meaningful new bilateral creditor, a $1.5 billion UAE loan in late 2024 that the IMF reportedly was, in the polite language of these things, upset about, because it disrupted the agreed debt management framework. First, Kenya is not Sri Lanka. Kenya is not Zambia. Kenya has not defaulted on any of its sovereign creditors. The shilling is, against expectations, stable and even appreciating. Foreign exchange reserves cover roughly 4.6 months of imports, well above the IMF's 3-month minimum threshold. The Central Bank of Kenya has demonstrated that it is, by global emerging market standards, a competent and credible institution. Inflation is back inside the target band, and critically, Kenya's debt is long-dated. Most of the Chinese loans have remaining maturities of 15 to 30 years, and Eurobonds are also being termed out. There is no sudden cliff. There is instead a chronic squeeze. Second, the absolute size of the debt, while large in dollar terms, is not extreme by international standards. The United States carries public debt of over 120% of GDP. Japan carries over 250%. Italy, France, the UK, all sit at debt-to-GDP ratios materially higher than Kenya's. Kenya's problem is not the level of debt per se. Kenya's problem is the cost of servicing that debt, in a country whose tax base is small, narrow, and politically combustible. That is the real numerical horror story. Let me give you the figure that should anchor your understanding. By 2024, Kenya was spending roughly 65 to 70% of its tax revenue on debt service. 2/3 of every shilling collected by the Kenya Revenue Authority went straight back out the door to creditors, most of them foreign, before a single shilling could be spent on schools, hospitals, roads, or the salaries of nurses and police officers. The United Nations, in a July 2025 report, formally sounded the alarm on Kenya's debt service costs, with the UN Conference on Trade and Development warning that the structure of the country's repayments was crowding out development spending. Kenya's interest payments alone, in 2024, exceeded combined public spending on health and education. That is the fiscal vice the Ruto administration is operating in. To keep paying creditors, it has to either tax more, Finance Bill 2024, Parliament burns, or cut spending, austerity, protesters return to the streets, or borrow more, which raises debt service costs further. It is, mechanically, a trap. Now, the smart, edgy commentary. Because there is a moral question buried in these numbers that the IMF will not address, and that the Ruto administration will not address, but which Kenyan civil society absolutely will. A meaningful portion of this debt was incurred under the Kenyatta administration through procurement processes that the Kenyan courts have in some cases formally ruled illegal, the SGR contract being the cleanest example, the Institute of Economic Affairs. Kenya estimates that during the Kenyatta years, somewhere between 20 to 40% of major infrastructure spending was lost to corruption, kickbacks, and inflated contracts. Some of that money ended up in offshore accounts, some ended up in palatial residences in Karen and Runda, some ended up in Dubai and London real estate. None of it is being clawed back to repay the debt it was used to incur. In June 2024, a Kenyan civil society activist named Okia Omtata, a senator and longtime anti-corruption campaigner, petitioned the Kenyan High Court arguing that a portion of Kenya's external debt should be classified as odious debt under international law, on the grounds that it was incurred through corrupt processes and used in ways that did not benefit the Kenyan people, and therefore cannot legally bind the citizens of Kenya. The court, as of mid-2025, has referred the petition to the Chief Justice for consideration. It is a long-shot legal argument. International doctrine on odious debt is unsettled and has rarely been successfully invoked. But it tells you something about where Kenyan public discourse is going. The argument that we, the public, should not have to repay debts that were stolen from us by our own elite is not a fringe argument anymore in Kenya. It is increasingly mainstream. Now zoom out. The IMF has a debt restructuring framework, the Common Framework, that is theoretically designed to help countries in Kenya's position negotiate haircuts with their creditors. Zambia has used it. Ghana has used it. Ethiopia is using it. Kenya has so far declined to invoke it, on the grounds that doing so would be a soft default, would cut off access to international capital markets, and would crash the shilling. This is a defensible technical position. It is also increasingly a politically untenable one, because every additional finance bill that the Kenyan public refuses to pay narrows the window in which Kenya can avoid invoking the Common Framework. The base case forecast from most sovereign debt analysts I've read, including from Telema, Fitch and the African development economist at Steers, is that probabilistically Kenya is more likely than not to enter some form of formal debt restructuring before 2028. The data certainly points in that direction. The political math points even more strongly in that direction. But none of this is preordained. Kenya could grow its way out, the Silicon Savannah could deliver, the agricultural sector could modernise, the diaspora could be turned into an investment partner rather than a remittance ATM, and the country could, plausibly, stabilise its debt trajectory without a formal restructuring. There is a path. It is narrow, and it requires a degree of fiscal discipline and political restraint that the current government has not so far demonstrated. But it exists. Speaking of fiscal discipline, we need to talk about the man at the centre of all of this. The man who made his political career by promising to be the president of the hustler, and who has, 2 years into the job, found himself the most unpopular Kenyan president in a generation. We need to talk about William Ruto. 9. The hustler president. William Ruto and the politics of Kenyan economics. You cannot understand the Kenyan economy in 2026 without understanding the man who currently runs it. So let me introduce you properly to William Samoei Ruto. The biography is, on paper, irresistible. Born in 1966 in a rural village in Sugoi, in the Rift Valley, to a family of subsistence farmers. Walked barefoot to school, famously sold chickens by the roadside as a teenager to help pay his school fees, a detail he would, decades later, weaponize into one of the most successful campaign narratives in modern African political history. Earned a PhD in plant ecology from the University of Nairobi. climbed his way up through Kenyan politics from a youth wing activist in the Daniel Arap Moi era, to Member of Parliament, to Minister of Agriculture, to Deputy President under Uhuru Kenyatta from 2013 to 2022. Then, in a remarkable political pivot, broke spectacularly with Kenyatta in the lead-up to the 2022 election and ran against the entire Kenyan political establishment, including against the Kenyatta-backed candidate Raila Odinga, on a populist economic platform he branded as the bottom-up economic transformation agenda. The campaign's slogan was simple, vivid, and brilliant. Hustler Nation. Ruto, deputy president for 9 years, the very definition of an establishment insider, ran successfully as the candidate of the informal economy, the bodaboda rider, the mamamboga, the fish vendor in Kisumu, the unemployed graduate in Eldoret. He framed Kenyan politics not as a tribal contest, which is how it had been framed for decades, but as a class contest, the hustlers, the ordinary working Kenyans, versus the dynasties, the Kenyatta and Odinga families, who had between them dominated Kenyan politics for 60 years. He promised cheap credit for small businesses through a new hustler fund. He promised cheaper fertilizer. He promised to lower the cost of unga, the maize flour that is the staple of every Kenyan meal. He promised to fix the bottom of the pyramid, and he framed everyone above him in the hierarchy as part of the problem. It worked. Ruto won the August 2022 election by a narrow margin. The Supreme Court of Kenya, after a contested petition, upheld the result. He was inaugurated on September 13, 2022. Within his first year, Ruto's administration stabilized inflation from a peak of 9.6% in 2022 to under 4% by 2025. The shilling, which had been on a brutal slide for 2 years, appreciated by 16% against the dollar in 2024, an astonishing reversal that meaningfully lowered import prices. The Central Bank of Kenya, under Governor Kamau Thuge, a former IMF official, which is either reassuring or alarming depending on your perspective, pursued an aggressive interest rate regime that crushed inflation expectations. The Hustler Fund, despite mixed reviews, has disbursed billions of shillings in microloans. The Affordable Housing Programme, the very same one funded by the controversial 2.5% housing levy, has actually broken ground on tens of thousands of new units. Ruto signed substantial bilateral trade agreements with the European Union and the United States. Joe Biden formally designated Kenya a major non-NATO ally during Ruto's May 2024 state visit to Washington, the first Sub-Saharan African country to receive that designation in nearly 2 decades. That is the argument: a reasonable, technocratic, market-friendly fiscal stabilization in genuinely brutal conditions. But here is the disconnect, and it is the disconnect that defines Ruto's presidency. The macroeconomic indicators improved while the lived experience of ordinary Kenyans got worse, or at least ordinary Kenyans firmly believed it got worse, which in politics is functionally the same thing. The reason is that the macroeconomic stabilization was paid for almost entirely by tax increases on consumption. The 2.5% housing levy, the doubled fuel VAT, the railway development levy, the import declaration fee, mobile money excise, new levies on imported finished goods. By the time the Finance Bill 2024 came up, proposing a 16% VAT on bread, an excise duty on cooking oil, a tax on sanitary pads, a 2.5% motor vehicle circulation tax, a withholding tax on income from infrastructure bonds. The cumulative effect on a median income Kenyan household was roughly a 12 to 18% reduction in real disposable income over 2 years. The hustler in Hustler Nation had been promised relief. What he got instead was the most aggressive tax collection regime in Kenyan history. The political pivot that did this was not just bad PR. It was, in retrospect, a fundamental misreading of what Ruto's voters had actually voted for. Kenyans in 2022 voted for redistribution. They got fiscal consolidation. The two are, in a country with Kenya's debt structure, largely incompatible. But Ruto did not say that during the campaign. He said the opposite. So when the bill came due in 2024, the political reaction was not just anger at the policy. It was a sense of betrayal. And Kenyan Gen Z made very clear in some viral protest signs that they understood the betrayal in essentially these terms. You promised to lower the cost of unga. You raised the price of bread. You said you were a hustler. You drive a private jet. There is also, hovering over all of this, a more uncomfortable subplot. Ruto came into office promising to eradicate corruption. That was a centerpiece of the Hustler Nation pitch. But within 2 years, investigative reporting by Kenyan outlets including The Standard, Daily Nation, and the Nation Media Group, plus reporting by Africa Confidential and the Africa Report, had documented a steady stream of allegations involving large procurement contracts, irregular cabinet appointments, and lavish presidential expenditure. The chartered jet to Washington in May 2024, with an estimated price tag of $1.5 million, became a meme that probably did more political damage than any individual policy decision. The contrast, bread tax for you, private jet for me, was just too vivid for the protest movement to ignore. By late 2024, Ruto's approval rating had fallen below 25% in Kenyan public opinion polls. By mid-2025, it was lower. Several respected Kenyan economists, including Ruto's own former economic advisor David Ndii, were publicly diagnosing the administration's strategy as fundamentally unsustainable. Ndii's argument, and it is worth taking seriously because he is the architect of the bottom-up agenda and is still, as of 2026 in Ruto's inner circle, is essentially that Kenya's tax base is structurally too narrow to service the existing debt, and the only honest path is a combination of aggressive growth-promoting reforms, fiscal restraint, and, at the right time, a formal debt restructuring. What he is too diplomatic to say in public, but what every Kenyan political analyst I read says privately, is that the politics of debt restructuring is impossible without the political legitimacy that the Ruto administration no longer has. So let me give you the state of play in the cleanest possible terms. As of early 2026, Kenya has a president whose macroeconomic numbers are improving, whose political approval is collapsing, whose flagship economic program triggered the largest popular uprising in modern Kenyan history, and whose central economic problem, the debt, cannot be solved without a degree of public trust that he has, through his own choices, almost entirely squandered. The next general election is scheduled for August 2027. Whether Ruto runs again, whether he survives a primary challenge from within his own coalition, whether the opposition can produce a credible alternative, these are open questions. But the broader question, which is what every economist watching Kenya is genuinely concerned about, is whether the country can hold its macroeconomic discipline through the 2027 election cycle without either provoking another protest wave or sliding into a debt restructuring that crashes the shilling. The honest probabilistic forecast based on the data and the political math is that the next 18 months are going to be the most economically delicate period for Kenya in at least 2 decades. Kenya is unlikely to default outright. The IMF will not allow that to happen. But the path between fiscal sustainability and political sustainability has narrowed to something like a thread. Whether the country can walk that thread depends on a long list of variables, none of which are entirely under Ruto's control. But before we wrap up, let me leave you with one more Kenya, the one that does not show up in the IMF reports, does not show up in the protest footage, and does not show up in the Silicon Savannah press releases. The Kenya that, over the next decade, is probably going to matter more than any of the others.
Politicians come and go. Approval ratings rise and crash. But the Kenya I haven't shown you yet doesn't care about any of that. It's bigger than Ruto, bigger than the IMF, and it's coming whether anyone in Nairobi is ready for it or not. Let me zoom out.
10. The quiet Kenya, demographics, geography, and the long view. Here's what almost nobody talks about when they talk about Kenya. Almost nobody, except occasionally the demographers and the regional economists at the World Bank, who have been quietly screaming about it for years. Kenya's population is going to grow from roughly 54 million today to approximately 90 million by 2050. That is a UN central projection estimate. It is not a worst-case scenario. It is the median expectation. The country will, within a generation, add roughly the population of present-day Germany, and it will do so on top of an economy that, even if it grows at a respectable 5% per year for the next 25 years, will still be a small fraction of Germany's. The implication, which Kenyan policymakers understand viscerally and rarely say out loud, is that Kenya cannot grow its way out of poverty by the same path Singapore or South Korea did. The arithmetic does not allow it. But that demographic pressure is also, paradoxically, Kenya's single most important long-term asset. Let me explain. The countries that grew rich in the late 20th century did so primarily by exploiting what economists call the demographic dividend. a window during which a country's working-age population grows much faster than its dependent population, generating a one-time, multi-decade boost to per capita output. South Korea hit this window in the 1970s. China hit it in the 1980s and 1990s. Most of the developed world has now passed through and is dealing with the opposite problem: aging populations, shrinking workforces, fiscal pressure on pension systems. Japan, Italy, and Germany are in active demographic decline. The United States is barely above replacement, propped up by immigration. China's working-age population has been shrinking since 2014. Kenya is at the front edge of its own demographic dividend window. The median Kenyan is 20 years old. Fertility rates have fallen rapidly, from about 8 children per woman in 1970 to roughly 3.4 today, and still declining. Life expectancy has climbed past 67. Vaccination rates and primary school enrollment are at historical highs. If you draw the demographic curves out, Kenya should hit peak working age share of population somewhere in the 2040s and 2050s, exactly the years during which the global economy will be desperate for the kind of young English-speaking digitally literate workforce that Kenya, structurally, is in a position to provide. The same Gen Z that lit Parliament on fire in 2024 is, in a longer-run macroeconomic sense, the most valuable economic asset Kenya has. That is why the diaspora story matters so much. Roughly 3 to 4 million Kenyans live outside the country, primarily in the United States, the United Kingdom, the Gulf states, and increasingly in Australia and Canada. They are on average more educated and more economically productive than the median Kenyan. They send back, as we discussed, over $5 billion a year in remittances, which is now the single largest source of foreign exchange for the country, larger than tea and tourism combined. In 2025, the Kenyan government launched the Kenya Diaspora Investment Strategy, 2025 to 2030, which explicitly attempts to channel diaspora flows out of pure consumption and into productive investment, diaspora bonds, pooled investment funds, structured real estate vehicles, business equity. Whether the strategy succeeds depends on a long list of execution details that the Kenyan civil service has not historically been brilliant at. But the concept is exactly right. A country whose largest export is its own people needs to figure out how to recapture some of the value those people generate abroad. That is the long game. The geography is, similarly, both a blessing and a problem. Kenya sits on the Indian Ocean coast at the natural maritime gateway to a landlocked region. Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, and Ethiopia all depend, to varying degrees, on the port of Mombasa for their imports. Mombasa is one of the busiest ports in East Africa, handling tens of millions of tons of cargo a year. Kenya is a founding member of the East African Community Trade Bloc, which now includes 7 countries with a combined population of roughly 300 million, and a member of COMESA, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. The African Continental Free Trade Area, which entered force in 2021, has the potential, if it is properly implemented, to create the world's largest single market by number of countries, and to give a regional logistics hub like Kenya a structural advantage that no individual member state can replicate. Kenya's geographic positioning is, in trade terms, genuinely excellent. The problem, as always, is climate. Kenya's agriculture is overwhelmingly rain-fed. The country has had 2 of its 4 worst droughts in recorded history during the past decade, including the 2020 to 2023 multi-year drought across the Horn of Africa, which affected an estimated 4.4 million Kenyans and killed millions of livestock. April 2024 brought the opposite problem: the most severe flooding Kenya had seen in decades, displacing more than 250,000 people and damaging crops. Climate variability is the single largest non-policy macroeconomic risk to Kenya's growth path. The African Development Bank, the World Bank, and Kenya's own national treasury all flag climate change as a top-tier downside risk in every economic outlook they publish. The country is, in effect, trying to industrialize during the same decades in which the climate it depends on is becoming materially less reliable. This is not an unsolvable problem. Irrigation, drought-resistant crop varieties, climate insurance products, and renewable energy investments all help, but it is a constant headwind. And that brings us to a final long-view observation, which I want you to sit with. If you take a wide enough lens, 50 years, not 5, Kenya's trajectory is dramatically better than its current crisis suggests. In 1963, the year of independence, Kenya was a poor, agrarian, ethnically fractured British colony with a per capita GDP of about $98, life expectancy of 47 years, and a literacy rate below 30%. In 2026, Kenya is a poor but rising, regionally dominant, technologically sophisticated lower middle-income country with a per capita GDP above $2,200, life expectancy of 67, near universal primary school enrollment, the third largest economy in Sub-Saharan Africa, the most successful mobile money platform in the world, the largest startup ecosystem on the continent, and a press and civil society vigorous enough to force the president to back down on a budget bill in front of the entire world. The trend line taken across the long arc is unmistakably positive. The question is not whether Kenya is rising. The data says clearly that it is. The question is how fast, how broadly distributed, and how stable that rise turns out to be over the next quarter century. Whether the Silicon Savannah extends its reach into the bottom half of Kenyan society or stays confined to the top 10%. Whether the debt trap is escaped through growth or through restructuring. Whether the political system produces leadership credible enough to restore the public trust that has been spent. Whether the climate cooperates. Whether the diaspora can be turned from a remittance source into an investment partner. Whether the demographic dividend is captured or squandered. Each one of those is a knife-edge question. None of them have predetermined answers. The probabilistic distribution of Kenya's possible futures, based on the data we have, on the policy track record and on the political trajectory, is, depending on which analyst you read, somewhere between cautiously optimistic and acutely fragile. The honest answer is that both descriptions are simultaneously true. 11. Final thoughts. A country on the edge of everything. Let's pull all of this together. Kenya, as we've now spent the last hour walking through, is one of the most fascinating economies on the planet. Not because it is the largest or the richest or the fastest growing, but because it is the country in which almost every major question of 21st century development economics is being argued out, in real time, in front of a global audience. It is the country that solved digital banking before Silicon Valley did, with a text message-based system on dumb phones that still moves 3 times its own GDP every year. It is the country that learned, the hard and expensive way, that taking $5 billion of Chinese debt to build a railway only works if the railway actually generates revenue, and that infrastructure megaprojects are, more often than not, a gamble against the most basic principles of cost-benefit analysis. It is the country whose Gen Z, organising on TikTok and X without a leader or a party, forced an incumbent IMF-aligned president to scrap his entire fiscal program in less than a week, rewriting in real time the rules of African political economy. It is the country whose largest single source of foreign exchange is no longer tea, no longer coffee, no longer tourism, but its own emigrants, sending dollars home from Houston and Manchester and Dubai. It is the country in which, on the same Tuesday afternoon, you can watch a parliament burn and a fintech founder close a Series B. The lessons here, for anyone watching from outside, are sharp and broadly applicable. First, mobile money and digital infrastructure can leapfrog physical banking, but only if the regulator gets out of the way at the right moment. The Central Bank of Kenya's 2007 decision to let M-Pesa exist is one of the most consequential regulatory calls in modern emerging market history. It is also, frankly, a call most regulators in most countries would have gotten wrong. Second, infrastructure debt, especially when sourced from non-traditional lenders with non-transparent contracts, will eat your fiscal space if the underlying asset does not generate revenue. The SGR is not a Chinese conspiracy. It is, more boringly and more importantly, a textbook case of an over-optimistic feasibility study married to a politically convenient procurement process. The same lesson is now playing out in Zambia, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka and Pakistan. It will play out in more countries before this decade is over. Third, the IMF can stabilise an economy in the short run and destabilise its politics in the medium run. The textbooks treat fiscal consolidation as a technical question. The Kenyan Gen Z movement has demonstrated vividly and at substantial human cost that fiscal consolidation in a country with a youth bulge, a smartphone, and a credibility deficit government is, instead, a deeply political question, and that the political answer can override the technocratic one. Fourth, the demographic dividend is real, but it is conditional. A young population is an asset only if there are jobs, infrastructure, and political stability to absorb it. Without those, a young population becomes a destabilizing force, exactly as Kenyan Gen Z has demonstrated. Every African country with a similar demographic profile, which is most of them, should be paying very close attention. Fifth, and finally, no country's trajectory is ever as simple as either the optimistic press release or the doom-laden investor note. Kenya in 2026 is simultaneously thriving and fracturing. Both pictures are real. Reasonable people, looking at the same data, come to opposite forecasts. The honest answer, as I've tried to give it throughout this video, is probabilistic. Kenya is more likely than not to muddle through the next 2 to 3 years without a sovereign default, more likely than not to retain its position as the most innovative economy in Sub-Saharan Africa, and more likely than not to face additional political turbulence in the run-up to the 2027 election. Beyond that, the variance widens dramatically. If I had to bet, and this is a bet, not prediction, I would bet on Kenya, long-term 25 years out, because the underlying ingredients are unusually good, because the demographic curve is unusually favourable, because the technology base is unusually strong, because the diaspora is unusually large and unusually engaged, and because, at the end of the day, the same political ferocity that lit Parliament on fire in 2024 is, when channeled through institutions rather than against them, exactly the kind of civic energy that builds a functioning democratic capitalist economy. Kenya's biggest problem, and Kenya's biggest asset, are the same thing. It's people. The country that figures out how to use that asset instead of taxing it into another revolt is going to be the East African powerhouse of the 21st century. That is the bull case. The bear case is everything we discussed about debt, climate, corruption, and political legitimacy. Pick your weighting. If this video helped you understand a country that almost nobody in the West takes the time to understand properly, do me 3 quick favours. Hit that like button. It really does help the algorithm push these deep dives to more people. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we do this for every major economy on the planet, and we have new ones coming out weekly. And let me know in the comments, which country should we break down next? I read all of them. Ethiopia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, the Philippines. Drop your suggestions and the most upvoted ones get prioritized. If you want more like this, check out our breakdown of Mexico's nearshoring boom, or our deep dive on the Czech economic paradox, both on our playlist. They're some of our most popular work. Thanks for spending an hour of your life on the economy of Kenya with me. Asante sana, as they say in Nairobi. See you in the next one. 11. Final thoughts. A country on the edge of everything. Let's pull all of this together. Kenya, as we've now spent the last hour walking through, is one of the most fascinating economies on the planet. Not because it is the largest or the richest or the fastest growing, but because it is the country in which almost every major question of 21st century development economics is being argued out, in real time, in front of a global audience. It is the country that solved digital banking before Silicon Valley did, with a text message-based system on dumb phones that still moves 3 times its own GDP every year. It is the country that learned, the hard and expensive way, that taking $5 billion of Chinese debt to build a railway only works if the railway actually generates revenue, and that infrastructure megaprojects are, more often than not, a gamble against the most basic principles of cost-benefit analysis. It is the country whose Gen Z, organising on TikTok and X without a leader or a party, forced an incumbent IMF-aligned president to scrap his entire fiscal programme in less than a week, rewriting in real time the rules of African political economy. It is the country whose largest single source of foreign exchange is no longer tea, no longer coffee, no longer tourism, but its own emigrants, sending dollars home from Houston and Manchester and Dubai. It is the country in which, on the same Tuesday afternoon, you can watch a parliament burn and a fintech founder close a Series B. The lessons here, for anyone watching from outside, are sharp and broadly applicable. First, mobile money and digital infrastructure can leapfrog physical banking, but only if the regulator gets out of the way at the right moment. The Central Bank of Kenya's 2007 decision to let M-Pesa exist is one of the most consequential regulatory calls in modern emerging market history. It is also, frankly, a call most regulators in most countries would have gotten wrong. Second, infrastructure debt, especially when sourced from non-traditional lenders with non-transparent contracts, will eat your fiscal space if the underlying asset does not generate revenue. The SGR is not a Chinese conspiracy. It is, more boringly and more importantly, a textbook case of an over-optimistic feasibility study married to a politically convenient procurement process. The same lesson is now playing out in Zambia, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka and Pakistan. It will play out in more countries before this decade is over. Third, the IMF can stabilise an economy in the short run and destabilise its politics in the medium run. The textbooks treat fiscal consolidation as a technical question. The Kenyan Gen Z movement has demonstrated vividly and at substantial human cost that fiscal consolidation in a country with a youth bulge, a smartphone, and a credibility deficit government is, instead, a deeply political question, and that the political answer can override the technocratic one.